So the carbon benefits project tools were developed by a whole consortium of different organisations. They were developed and released in 2013. The greenhouse gas accounting tools were actually developed by Colorado State University, and this was backed up by soils information provided by ESRI, which is the World Soils Information Centre, and then there's a range of socio-economic tools which were developed by the University of East Anglia in the UK. So just a little bit of background before we get started. In terms of greenhouse gas accounting, the agriculture and the forestry and other land use sector is different from other sectors. And this is because it's very complicated. You have a whole range of different things going on. You have different greenhouse gas emissions coming from different places. But in addition, you also have sinks of carbon dioxide. So plants take up carbon dioxide when they photosynthesize. So you have the potential for greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, to be stored in biomass, trees, shrubs, grasses, etc. And it's the same with soils. You have the potential for the way that we use and manage our land to lead to carbon being sequestered and also stored in soils. So it's the only sector that actually has the potential to be part of the solution as well as part of the problem in terms of climate change mitigation. If we just have a look at this diagram, this is a diagram which was produced by a colleague at Colorado State University called Amy Swan, and it shows you, it summarises all the different greenhouse gas sources and sinks that you get associated with the agriculture, forestry and other land use sector. So as I said, when we take trees away from a system, we lose carbon into the atmosphere, either through decomposition, or it can be if we use burning as a means of clearing land, and this often happens in deforestation. Then you get greenhouse gases associated with that, non-CO2 greenhouse gases, methane, N2O, etc. And of course, burning is also used sometimes as a way of managing land. So many grasslands are routinely burned, and during that burn you'll get a release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. You also, if you have livestock in part of your system, then the livestock themselves will produce emissions. You get methane emissions directly from ruminant animals such as cattle. You also get emissions of greenhouse gases associated with the manure that's produced by the animals. So methane, N2O. If this manure is returned to the soil, then you'll get a build-up of carbon in the soil from the manure. You then have soil emissions of N2O, and this can depend upon the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that you use. If you add nitrogen fertilizer to the soil, some of it is actually lost back to the atmosphere as N2O emissions. If you have nitrogen fixing plants, such as legumes, involved in your system, this can also result in N2O emissions. And then the way that we manage our soil, the way that we plough it, and what we do with the crop residues, the straw that's not harvested, if that's returned to the soil, this can all determine how much carbon ends up being stored in the soil and how much is released back to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And then finally, in systems such as flooded systems, such as rice or natural wetlands, you have anaerobic respiration, and this results in methane being released to the atmosphere. So I guess the overall message is that this is an extremely complicated sector. It's very difficult in terms of carbon accounting, greenhouse gas accounting, to estimate the overall impact of your land management project on the atmosphere, on climate change mitigation. And so it was with this in mind, and also keeping in mind that it's not possible to measure everything, especially if you have a land management project and your main emphasis is improving people's livelihoods or reducing land degradation, you're not necessarily going to have the money, resources and time to measure all of these different sources, all of these different sinks. So what you need is a tool which can help you to estimate these things. And that's what we were tasked with developing for the Global Environment Facility. Okay, so the Carbon Benefits Project, which we developed and as I said was released back in 2013, provides tools for the GEF and other land management projects to estimate, track and report carbon stock changes and greenhouse gas emissions which result from land management projects. So the tools that we developed are aimed at managers and potential managers of Global Environment Facility, which is GEF, or other land management projects, other people at GEF implementing agencies and executing agencies, but basically anybody who wants to estimate the greenhouse gas impact of land management activities. The system produces a standardised summary report, which is a PDF, and this could be used by GEF or other programme officers or other funding agencies who want to have multiple reports in the standardised format. So people such as Robert, we have online, who's joined us, who is a programme officer who's in charge of several GEF projects. They may want to have a standardised output so they can compare them all with each other. It's also, I think, useful for people who are deciding which projects that they want to fund to have a quick and easy way when you submit a project proposal. You can have a way of saying, well, if I was to be funded on this, here is my potential impact on climate change mitigation. So features of the CBP tools are that they're online, they're completely free, anybody can just log on and use them. They're user-friendly, they can be used at any stage of a project. So as I said, you could use them at the proposal stage when you start off. You can use them for projects with different types of different amounts of data. So as you're going through your project and you collect more data, you can use them. They give spatially explicit output. So what I mean by this is they actually start off with a map. So the first thing we'll do, and we'll look at this in the next session of this training session, is that you pull up a map and you can either draw polygons or points and tell the system where it is you're working. And the carbon benefits tools at the moment are the only example of a greenhouse gas calculator that allows you to do this. It's very useful because it allows you, if you have a landscape scale project, it allows you to look at multiple different areas at the same time. And as I said, it also gives you a report in a standardized format. So the tools are actually scenario analysis tools. So rather than just giving you a snapshot and inventory of what's happening at one point in time, they actually allow you to compare different scenarios with each other. So you have to describe what's happening in your initial situation. This is at year 0 before anything starts. You then choose a time period. This can be anything you want, it's up to the user. So for example, 10 years. Over those 10 years, you have to have an idea of what your project is either doing or wants to do. So a project scenario. And then you need to construct a business as usual scenario. So if your project was never to happen, what would happen to this area of land over those 10 years in the absence of your project? Then what the system is actually doing is comparing all of the different stock changes and greenhouse gas emissions associated with a project scenario compared to a business as usual scenario. And it's this difference between the two which is the carbon benefit, the overall net greenhouse gas benefit. So if we have a quick look at this example here, we start off with an area of bare degraded grassland. Under a business as usual scenario, we can assume that in 10 years' time it would remain as bare degraded grassland, and you would get some carbon lost from the soil because of decomposition. Our project, however, is going to come in, we're going to cordon off this area, we're going to reduce grazing pressure, keep livestock out, and this is going to result in the grasses revegetating and coming back. We also might introduce a few shrubs, plant a few shrub species in the area, so we'll get increased carbon stored in above ground biomass, we'll get increased carbon stored in soils. But it also might be the case that while we're doing this, we add a bit of nitrogen fertilizer while we plant our tree species. And then during this time, we have to take into account emissions from the synthetic fertilizer compared to stock changes in the biomass and the soils. So it's the difference between the two. Okay. So in the background of the carbon benefits project tools, we have what's called the IPCC method. This is a method developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a huge range of equations which was put together as part of a large literature review. All of these equations basically look at one single format. The amount of greenhouse gas emissions or stock changes depends upon your activity. So this is what is being done and where you're doing it, times an emission factor. So for example, activity data could be things like how much area is being planted to trees, how much nitrogen fertilizer is being applied in a cropping system, how many dairy cattle have you got. So it's what you're doing and where you're doing it. And the carbon benefits tools actually collect all of this activity data. And there's a range of emission factors, which are called tier 1 factors, which are already provided for you through the IPCC method. So through this huge literature review that the IPCC did. Your emission factor is then a factor which turns your activity into an emission per unit of activity. So for example, if it's something like area being planted to trees, trees are going to be taking up carbon, storing carbon, and this depends upon the growth rate. And the growth rate will be different for different types of trees of different ages. So there'll be an emission factor for the growth rate for different types of trees for different ages. If it's the amount of fertilizer that's being applied, then it will depend upon the type of fertilizer, the amount of fertilizer, and this will then have an emission factor which will relate this to an N2O emission per unit of N being applied. If we have number of dairy cattle, it will be methane emissions directly from those cattle, and again this will depend on the type of animal and where in the world the animal is. There's a different emission factor for cattle in Africa compared to cattle in the USA, for example. So we'll come back to this again, and if there's any questions about this at the end of the presentation, we can revisit this. But this is the central principle that's behind the equations being used in the carbon benefits project tools. Now I should say there's this whole list of default emission factors, but we also have the flexibility within the CBP tools for you to add in your own emission factors. So if you know you have your own growth rate that's highly specific to the area you're working in, you can replace it. And that's in the detailed assessment, which we'll look at on Wednesday. Okay, so this is just a sort of workflow of all the process you need to go through while you're using the CBP tools. Firstly, you go to what we call a project information module. You put in some very basic information about the name of your project, project ID code, when it started, how long it lasts. Quite importantly, you choose the country that you're working in. And this is because this then puts you in the right place on the map when you go to the next stage. Project regions, communities you're working with, what your project activities are, project goals, etc. Your next step is then to tell the system where it is geographically that you're actually working, and you can determine your project activity areas. It pulls up a map, and in the next session I'll show you how you can actually put your spatial information in. We then have a guidance module, which we're not going to cover in this training. This basically provides guidance on which of our tools to use. It also helps you to look at, it has a range of different protocols for taking measurements in the field if you want to go into the field to do that. And we then have the tools themselves. So we've got 3 tools: simple assessment, detailed assessment, and dynamic modelling option. And we're only going to look at, in this training, the simple assessment and the detailed assessment. Okay, so firstly, let's look at the simple assessment. This, as I said, uses all of these tier 1 emission factors, all of these default emission factors. It also provides an awful lot of information for you, which you choose from drop-down menus. And this is to try to make things as simple and quick as possible for the user. In order to use it, you just need a computer with an internet connection because it's online. You need information on land management activities and where they occur, and you need an idea of land use and management under a baseline as well as under a project scenario. So if you remember our diagram where we're comparing one against the other. So I'd say the simple assessment is suitable for use in projects which don't have many resources for carbon monitoring and reporting. It's also suitable for people who are developing project proposals, but it could be used by anybody. If you have, for example, a project where your main emphasis is improving people's livelihoods, but you want to do some quick carbon reporting, then the simple assessment is a good option. Both tools are available in English, Chinese, Spanish, Russian, French and Portuguese, and we're also adding other language facilities, including Amharic, which is an Ethiopian language that's going to be added very soon. So the detailed assessment, as the name suggests, allows you to actually describe things in more detail. You can create your own crop, grass, forest, agroforestry types and also systems. And you have this option to use your project-specific emission factors. It's very, very flexible and it allows you to reduce your level of uncertainty by making things as specific as possible to your own project. So in order to use a detailed assessment, you need the same as a simple assessment, plus you need some specific information on crop, grass, forest species and systems if you want to put them in. If you do decide you want to go into the field to take measurements, then obviously you need resources and facilities for going into the field and doing this. I should say though, it's not always the case if you want to improve your emission factors. It could be that these are available in local literature. So it might be there are PhD theses, or there could be publications where you could draw relevant emission factors from. So the detailed assessment is actually suitable for projects who want to reduce uncertainties in emissions estimations, and it's suitable for use in projects which have more of an emphasis on carbon benefits. Okay, we do actually also have some socio-economic tools. So having gone through the process of looking at different land management activities and seeing which are best in terms of carbon, in terms of climate change mitigation, you really do then want to ask the question, well, which of these are economically sensible or socially or culturally sensible? What is the real world situation of being able to apply these land management practices? And so we have a simple cost-benefit analysis, and then we have an online version of the DPSIR. This is a qualitative tool which allows you to look at the drivers, pressures, state, impact and response. It's basically a way of considering what the barriers to people adopting particular land management activities might be. And then finally we have our reporting module, and this produces two types of report. A PDF file, which is a standard PDF. It's not interactive, so it's just a sheet for people to have a look at, and you can send this off to funding agencies, etc. And then we also have an Excel file, which is the detailed report, and this allows you to actually play with the data and use the data. Okay, so now I'm going to just quickly take you through the kinds of data that you need to be able to use the CBP system. You need details on land use and management activities that will be changed as part of the project. And this, we really need to emphasize this. If you have a large project area, you don't need to describe everything in that project area if there are areas which your project isn't going to change. So you need to hone in on those areas where your project is actually going to do something and make a difference. Otherwise, you'll find you're describing lots of land management over and over again, none of which is actually going to change. Okay, just to emphasize again, only include those areas which are going to change, and this will allow you to assess the carbon and greenhouse gas benefits of the project. So there are a range of land use types listed in the carbon benefits tools, and you'll see this as we start to use them. These are the IPCC land use categories. And for each of these, there's specific types of information that you need to have. Most of this information is the kind of thing that land management projects will actually have anyway. And once we start to work with land management projects, we find that most people are collecting or have this information anyway. So the first for forest land would be locations of native forests or plantations and the extent of interventions. So by interventions, I mean where your project is actually doing something. Your forest plantation system types. So what kind of forest is it? Is it tropical native forest? Is it a plantation, for example? The age range of your forest, is it less than 20 years or is it more than 20 years? Is it a well-established mature forest? And this is because there are different growth rates associated to the forests for different age ranges. Natural losses, so are there any losses from fire, wind, pest disease or drought? Timber harvests, are people taking timber out or are people taking fuel wood out? So you can see it's really growth rate minus losses. That's what your forest calculations are. Case then for grasslands, we have location of grassland system. The grassland condition, is it improved, nominal, native or degraded? And there's a part in the system where you can hover over and it will give you a definition for each of these to make it a little bit clearer. Some grassland systems have fertilizer applications, so if so, you need to say the amount of fertilizer, percentage of nitrogen in the fertilizer. Is your grassland system being burned, and if so, how often? Is it a silver pastoral system? So this means, are there any tree species or other woody species that are in your grassland system? If so, we need to account for the carbon that's in that woody biomass, as well as the carbon in the grassland itself. And then you have to describe tree type, tree age ranges, natural losses, losses from timber harvesting, and losses from fuel wood gathering. And you can see that these questions here are basically the same as those forest land questions. And any place in the system where you have trees or other woody biomass, you get the same repetition of these questions. Perennial crops, again, these are woody crops. So something like coffee, tea, locations of perennial cropping systems, extent of interventions, the crop type, fertilizer applications, and then again, tree type, tree age ranges, and your losses, natural losses, and anthropogenic losses. For annual cropland, you need the location and extent of your annual cropland, your cropping systems and crop rotations, your management status, is it improved? And this is a catch-all term that applies to if you're adding non-nitrogen fertilizer, irrigation cover crops, legumes in your rotation, or if you're using high-yielding varieties. And because all of these things will influence the rate at which your crop grows, the rate at which it will accumulate carbon. Your tillage system, is it full, is it reduced, is it no-till? Fertilizer application, how much fertilizer is being added, what's the percentage of nitrogen in your fertilizer? How your residue, your crop residue, so after you've harvested, you've taken away the part that you want to harvest, what happens to the straw that's left behind? Is it being burned, is it being collected, grazed by animals, or is it being left in the field? For agroforestry systems, so by this we mean where you have a mixture of a tree crop with an annual crop growing underneath, you have to describe both parts. So you have to describe the location of the annual cropland that's underneath and the extent of your interventions, what your cropping system is, your crop rotations, how that's being managed in the same way as annual cropland. So things like tillage system, residue management. And then for the tree part of your agroforestry system, what are your natural losses? Again, fire, wind, pest disease, timber harvesting, fuel wood gathering. So you can see there's a lot of repetition in the tools to try to make it as easy as possible. For settlements, the only thing we describe in settlements is actually the trees. So if you have a village, a town, or even a city, and you have trees within that, you can include that in your accounting. and we have the percentage, we have either percentage crown cover if you have satellite image, if it's a large area, or you can have the actual number of trees. And again, things like tree types, tree age ranges, natural losses, anthropogenic losses. For wetlands, and I know there's quite a lot of people, especially in the Nairobi group, working on wetlands, at the moment we just have the area and extent of the wetlands, and we also include the drainage status, and that will account for methane emissions. So the wetlands part of the system is possible to do accounting at the moment, and it is something we want to improve and expand on in the future. For livestock, rather than saying area covered by livestock, we actually describe numbers of livestock, so numbers of heads, and then what type of livestock they are. So you'd say how many livestock you have and which of these different categories they are: dairy cattle, swine, goats, sheep, etc. You then also have to tell the system the number of months per year that the livestock are present in the project activity area. And this is to account for things like transhumance, nomadic systems, where people are bringing livestock into an area, they graze for part of the year and then they move on. Once you've described the livestock themselves, you then have to describe the manure management, so the percentage of manure that's being managed in different ways, and you have a range of different options. Things like, is it left in the field, is it left in the pasture, is it put into an anaerobic digester, is it being burned, etc. Okay, so just to revisit some of these terms that we've been using, IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. A polygon, and we'll look at this in the next session, is a spatial area associated with project activities. It's usually larger than 10 hectares. So if you have an area that's larger than 10 hectares, we'd advise you to draw a polygon. If it's smaller than 10 hectares, you'd probably be okay with just drawing a point. Project activity area or intervention area is a point or polygon where sustainable land management project interventions are expected to occur. So again, this idea of only describe those areas where you're actually going to make a difference, where something is going to change. Okay, so carbon benefits, this is a term that we use to mean net greenhouse gas balance. So this is carbon stock changes plus greenhouse gas emissions, and we use these terms interchangeably. Your greenhouse gas flux is your emission of a greenhouse gas from land use practices, and it's shown as a positive flux value. So if you've got emissions going into the atmosphere, it's shown as positive, whereas sequestration is shown as negative. So if it's being sucked up by the land, then it has a negative value. All flux is expressed in CO2 equivalents. So this is the idea that different greenhouse gases have different impacts on the atmosphere in terms of warming, but so that we can compare them with each other, we give them a global warming potential, and they're all expressed in terms of CO2 equivalents. Okay, area that we work in, we always work in hectares. So if you have your data in acres, you'll have to change it, put it into hectares to put it into the system. Carbon greenhouse gas flux, again, it's always CO2 equivalents. The time frame that you want to do the analysis for is completely up to the user. It can be the length of your project, it could be longer, it can be shorter, it's up to you. And the main greenhouse gases that are included in the system are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Okay, so the aims of this training is really for you to become familiar with the CBP system, to understand the information and data that's needed to use the CBP tools, to have a go at using some of the CBP tools with sample data, and to have a go at using the CBP tools, hopefully with your own data by Friday, and also to provide us with comments and feedback. Okay, so in a moment we can go to the CBP site. I think we'll just have a little bit of time for any questions on this main presentation before we then move on to look at describing your project spatially in the CBP system. So I think because there's not actually that many of us, if people do want to ask questions, you can probably unmute your microphone and go ahead and ask a question. Okay, so as I said, the CBP is the only greenhouse gas accounting tool that we know of at the moment that has this spatial component to it. And it's particularly suited because of this to projects which cover landscapes or different areas, even spread across different countries, and have a range of different things going on at the same time. And typically we find that Global Environment Facility and other land management projects tend to work in this way. You might cover a large landscape where you have reforestation in one area, introduction of conservation agriculture in another, etc. Okay, so once you've put in your basic information about your project, you'd then be at what we call the project description module. So this is the place where you describe spatially where your project activities are taking place. So the goal for this section is to help workshop participants to become familiar with the project description module and to learn how to enter, manage and delete a project activity area as a polygon, to enter, manage and delete a project activity area as a point, to upload project activity areas as a GIS file, and to upload project activity areas as a list of points. So you can see there's several different ways that you can get your spatial information into the system. Again, we'll just go over these definitions quickly. So project activity area, intervention area is where you're actually going to be making a change. Polygon is greater than 10 hectares, a point less than 10 hectares. Project activity area group, a group is a set of points or polygons that share the same intervention activities. So when you start to put your areas in, if, for example, you're working with lots of smallholder farmers which are dotted across a landscape and you wanted them all to introduce agroforestry, you could group all of these together and you can describe them in the system all at once. And this prevents you having to describe things hundreds and hundreds of times over. Okay, so when we go onto the CBP system, which I'll show you how to do in a minute, you can go to the project description module. Everything in the system works on these set of menus which go from left to right, and then you work your way down each menu. So step 1 says define your project boundaries. You would click onto this. It would then pull up a map, and this map will depend upon the country that you told the system you were working in the first place. It actually is Google Maps, so if you're familiar with how Google Maps works, then you will know how to work this. You can look at a street view, an aerial view, or a hybrid of both. There are a number of different controls on the form, some of them the same as Google, so they allow you to zoom in and out. If you then want to do something on the form, you click on the button, and once you finish working, click on it again. So, for example, we can add an area by point. If we click on Add Area by Point, and you would click on the map, Add Area by Polygon, and I'll show you in the actual system in a moment. You click on the map, click and drag and click and drag. If you then want to delete a polygon or modify it, you go to Edit, Modify Point or Polygon, or Delete Area. So, for example, click to create a polygon, and then click around the boundaries and double click when you're finished. Click to delete, and we also have a short video, a short help video, which shows you how to do this. click to change or modify, and this can modify the group that your polygon or point is assigned to, as well as the polygon itself. All of your polygons have to be assigned to a group, so if you only have one, it has to be assigned to a group of one. This is just the way that the system is set up at the moment. Okay, just taking you through if you want to create a point, create a polygon, delete a point. Your second option then is to upload point coordinates from a file. If you have a TXT file where you have GPS coordinates, you can add these into the system and it will give you a series of points, or you can also enter your point coordinates one at a time. If you want to upload them from a file, you then select, you select the file in this box here. It then asks you to put in the name of your project activity area points, name of the groups that the points belong to, and you can put in the latitude and longitude if you want to put in points one at a time. Okay. If you then want to upload a file, a GIS file, which has your project activity areas in, again, you choose the name of the file, and this time your GIS file has to have a column in the associated database file which gives the name of your project activity areas, the names of the polygons, the group they're associated with, and the area that they're associated with. And we can have a look at this when we do the example, the agroforestry example that we're going to do later today. And then you simply click upload and your GIS file should upload into the system. The system has data layers on climate regions, soils, biomass stocks, and livestock and manure data. This is the standard default data which is being used to make the calculations. If at any point you want to have a look at these data layers, you can go to step 2 and you can click here and you can actually pull them up, and you can either look at the PDF file or you can download a zip file to your computer. Once you've put your spatial information into the system, you then have to tell the system how much area is in each of your different land use categories. Year 0, so this is your initial land use before you start working. Then you have to put in the amount of area that will be in the different land use categories under a baseline scenario at the end of your baseline scenario for your given length of time, and the end of your project scenario for your given length of time. So if it was 10 years, it would be year 0, how much land is in different land use categories, and then at the end of the 10 years, if the project was not to happen, how much area would be in your different land use categories, and if you're under your project scenario, how much area. And it could be that this doesn't change, so it could be that you have a grassland project which starts as grassland and remains as grassland for the whole 10 years, but that under the baseline scenario you're going to have a lot of grazing pressure, it's going to be overgrazed, and under your project scenario you're going to exclude livestock. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the actual system itself now. I'm going to log on. And in a moment when we set up accounts, you're going to click on this not registered link that's just here. And this not registered link is going to ask you to then put in your name and an email address, and it will send you an email so that you can set up an account. The first page that you'll see will then be a list of the projects that you have. If you are setting yours up for the first time, this will be blank because you haven't obviously set up any projects. So I'm just going to open up a project that I've already set up, which is called this Niger Demo 1. To access the tools, we go to this Toolkit Advisor link. We're going to choose Simple Assessment to begin with. And I'm then going to go to Project Description, and this is where you can put in your spatial information. I'm going to click Draw or Edit Project Locations on a Map. Because I'm working in Niger, it pulls up a map of Niger for me. Then if I click on this Add Area by Point, I can click anywhere on the map. It adds a point for me. It asks me to name my point. It asks which group do I want to assign it to. I've got 13 groups set up here, so I'll assign it to group 10. And it asks me how large it is, so I can say it was 9 hectares, and then I can save it. And because it's a point, it's just going to assume that it's 9 hectares, with the central point of which is in the centre of this point. Okay. If I wanted to add an area by polygon, I would click Add Area by Polygon, and this time I can start to click around the edges of an area that I'm interested in. For those of you who are familiar with GIS, it's just the same process. And then when I'm done, I double click and it sets up my polygon for me. It asks me to name it. And again, it asks me to assign it to a group. And this time it's created a new group. So I can either put it in a new group or I can assign it to an existing one. Okay, so you can see these are all the different areas that I've set up. If I wanted to delete one, I would click on Delete Area. Okay. Okay. So, are there any questions at the moment? So this is an example exercise. It's a hypothetical example of a project in Western Kenya in the Kakamega forest. Even though it's hypothetical, a lot of the data, information, and land use is actually taken from a real project which we worked with in Western Kenya. So the goals of this particular project are to decrease soil erosion, to improve food security, and also to diversify the agricultural economy. So to achieve these goals, practices that will be evaluated are the introduction of agroforestry. So as many of you know who already work with agroforestry projects, agroforestry has greenhouse gas benefits in terms of it sequesters carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the trees that are being added, and it also sequesters carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in soils. So having plants that grow at different depths, they have different rooting depths, you're going to increase the amount of organic matter that's being put back into the soils. There are also, of course, other associated benefits with agroforestry. It improves crop yields, you diversify cropping systems and your economics, so you have different products that you can sell in different markets. It's been shown to improve water quality, reduce soil erosion, and also sustainably managed agroforestry systems can be a source of livestock fodder, fuel, wood, food, and also building materials. So, we're identifying the locations of where our agroforestry is going to be introduced. We're going to do this by using points. We're going to upload a points file, and each of these points is actually a smallholder farmer who is going to introduce agroforestry because of the project, and these are dotted across our landscape. Here we can see this is the edge of the Kakamega forest, and these are smallholders who are living just on the edge of the Kakamega forest here. As I said in the previous presentation, points can be identified by drawing them or selecting them by uploading latitude and longitude, and you can also upload a text file which has got all of your latitude and longitude in, and that's what we're going to do for this exercise. Okay, so we're comparing two scenarios over a 10-year period. Again, the time period can be anything you like, but in this case we've chosen 10 years. So we have to describe our initial situation, year 0. We have to describe how things are going to be under our project scenario, which is introducing our agroforestry. And we also have to describe how things would have been if the project hadn't happened. What would the smallholder farmers have carried on doing? So our initial land use is our areas start off as 190 hectares of maize, sorghum and millet, which is being grown intercropped with legumes. It's got full tillage and the farmers are adding just 5 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen, which is quite low. And they're collecting all the residue because they're using it for animal fodder. That's our initial situation. That 190 hectares is actually all of the land added together that those smallholder farmers own, so all those dots that you saw. We can assume that under a business as usual baseline scenario, this will actually remain the same over the next 10 years. It will remain as being maize, sorghum and millet, intercropped with legumes, fully tilled, residue being collected. So it's quite a low input farming system, and we can say that this is what the farmers will carry on doing if our project doesn't intervene. Okay, so our project scenario is that we're going to introduce some agroforestry systems. It's going to be an avocado and banana with cereals and legumes growing underneath. And again, it's going to be on the whole 190 hectares. They're still going to grow maize, sorghum and millet intercropped with legumes, but they're going to change their tillage system so it's reduced tillage, and they're going to increase the amount of nitrogen that's being added, 50 kilograms per hectare, because the project is going to subsidise fertiliser inputs for them. We're also going to allow the landholders to have some livestock. So livestock are going to be introduced into the area, and the crop residue, rather than being taken off the land, is going to be grazed in situ on the fields. Okay, so this is our initial land use, 190 hectares of annual crops, maize, sorghum, millet, intercropped with legumes, 5 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen being added to the maize. Crop residue is being collected. Our project scenario is it's going to be replaced with 190 hectares of avocado, banana with cereal and legume. The cereal is going to be maize, sorghum, millet, intercropped with legumes. We have reduced tillage this time. We're applying 50 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen. The residue is being grazed. And the livestock to be introduced is going to be 37 dairy cattle and 74 goats. So of course, when we introduce dairy cattle, there's going to be emissions associated with the dairy cattle themselves, methane emissions. There's also going to be N2O and methane emissions from the manure. However, the manure that's produced by the animals can also act as a soil amendment, so it can be added to the soil and it can lead to a build-up of organic matter. So it's important to balance manure additions with plant nutrition needs, soil health and water quality. Okay, so I think we'll have a little bit of time now for any questions, either about the simple assessment, but also before we do exercise 1, any about the specific exercise that you're going to be doing.